Super. So most of you already probably have a good sense of the Florida accountability system. But just to level set for some of you who don't, and to level set, I'm going to walk through at a very high level what the accountability system looks like, what are the pieces of the puzzle, and who are the main entities that are responsible for educating our students. Feel free to interrupt me if I go too fast or if you have a question, but generally my idea here is to walk through this very first slide that will talk about the duties, the powers, the responsibility of the legislature, the state board, the commissioner, and the district school boards, and then to generally talk about how standards flow into curriculum, into assessments, into data, and why we measure what we use the data for student, school, and teacher performance. So that's the overarching goal of today's course. And again, please feel free to stop. Either myself, Chair Baleka, or Jason should be able to answer any question that you have. So piggybacking off of what the chairman said, Florida's accountability system is built on the premise that all students can learn. So there is an undoubted belief and rooted deep in our data that every student can learn. So when we talk about everything inside school accountability, we're looking at your highest performing to your lowest performing students, and we're always looking and striving to close the achievement gap. In looking at school accountability and who's responsible for what, I'm going to go through this very first slide. So first we have the legislature. This is generally, you have a ton of responsibilities, but for education, your general responsibilities include establishing the statewide education policy and the accountability system for the state. Secondly, you appropriate all the funds for state education. And then specific to the topic at hand on accountability, the legislature is the entity that sets the grade levels and subject areas included in the statewide system. So your subject areas are your English, language arts, math, fine arts, histories. Then you move to the state board, and the state board's responsibilities are to adopt the standards in those subject areas. They also are the entity that's going to select and set the passing scores on all of your statewide assessments. Their other responsibility is to monitor changes to student data privacy protections, and then most comprehensively, it's to implement, coordinate, and supervise the system of our public schools. The commissioner, and our current commissioner is Commissioner Stewart, she serves as the Chief Education Officer. The commissioner's responsibility within standards is to propose standards for adoption to the State Board of Education. The commissioner effectively designs and implements the statewide assessment system, as well as adopts the list of instructional materials that districts may or may not use. And instructional materials are the tools that teachers use, the curriculum that teachers use every day in the classroom to teach the standards. What you'll see here in this last one is the district school boards. The district school boards have the responsibility to implement the standards at the local level. They're going to be the group that administers the state and the local assessments. The district school board monitors student progress. It's the entity that selects the curriculum for the kids in the classroom. They select and adopt instructional materials. I'll go into that a little bit further. There's an instructional materials process. Commissioner has some responsibilities here, and local school districts over the years have gained more responsibility in this area as well. And finally, the district school boards have to report data to the Department of Education.
Question. Charter schools fall into this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a great question. Charter schools are free public schools.
They don't have to take the same state assessments.
They
correct?
do. They do. Yes. Just to kind of go backwards, talking about Florida's commitment to accountability. We can look all the way back to 1971 when the Florida legislature passed its first statewide assessment program, where it was going to start testing students in reading, writing, and math. In 1976, the legislature established standards for high school graduation, course credits, mastery of basic skills, functional literacy tests. In 1995, schools were ranked high performing, low performing. And then in 1996, the state board adopted the Sunshine State Standards. So just to show you that for nearly 50 years, this legislature has been committed to accountability. And to refer back to what the chairman said, it's evolved. As early as 1999, we changed the legislature changed the designations of high performing, low performing to A, B, C, D, and F, no E, and F schools. They expanded the FCAT to include reading and math in grades 3 through 10. In 2011, the legislature adopted a teacher evaluation system. And then in 2014 and 15, we saw some revisions to both the statewide accountability plan, to the teacher evaluation plan, again, to reflect the updating of the system, to reflect the changing of the system, and to really mirror more what's going on in our schools and with our teachers. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? Nope. All right. So accountability is the way that we hold the adults in the system accountable for student learning. By using our statewide assessment program, the assessments are aligned to the standards, then we're able to, and the legislature is able to evaluate and publicly report to students, parents, and teachers how teachers are doing, how the schools are doing, and how the students are doing. And what we hope to see in all cases is that there's rising student achievement. And in cases where there is not, we want to direct efforts to bring in resources to help those schools and those teachers, those principals, and the students to get them back on the path of rising student achievement. So standards. Standards are defined expectations of what students should learn by the end of the school year in each grade level and each subject area. Again, the commissioner, through a process with the State Board of Education, is the entity that comes up with the standards. And a perfect example of a standard is we expect kindergarten students by the end of the year to know what 2 + 2 = 4. There's lots of ways to get to that, and that's where curriculum comes in. And that's the decision of the school district and the teacher on how am I going to teach why 2 + 2 = 4. A little history on standards. In 1996, as I said earlier, we had the Sunshine State Standards. And then in 2010, the legislature adopted the next generation Sunshine State Standards. And then just in 2014, we revised the standards to the Florida State Standards. I covered curriculum for the most part, but curriculum decisions, the point here really is that curriculum decisions, including your textbooks, your programs to use, those are just made by your local school district. This is where instructional materials comes into place. So the Department of Education has a process to review all of the instructional materials, and it adopts a statewide list of instructional materials. Districts can choose to pull something off of that, and they know that when they do, that those materials are aligned to the Sunshine State Standards. So we're looking at continuity. We want the standards to be aligned. We want the material to be aligned to the standards, aligned to the tests. However, districts have the flexibility, if they have the manpower, the desire, and the want, to adopt their own instructional materials. And there's a process for instructional materials that includes the review by the local school district, and a parent, I believe, is also part of that process. So instructional materials, curriculum can very much be a very local decision if the district has the capacity to do so.
Can I ask a question? Then?
Sure.
Yes. The question is, you're saying that the standards are first done by the commissioner or the board as to what type of instructional materials can be taught, and then the school district, then they decide, do they decide only from that list, or you said they're allowed to go off of the list?
Sure. So the legislature chooses, the legislature establishes the subject matter areas. So once the legislature establishes the subject matter areas, again, reading, math, science, history, then the department goes through a process, and I can always flip to Jason if you want to know a little bit more about the process, to develop the standards. It's done with content experts in each area in several different work groups, and then there's also a parent initiative in there. Is there anything else to add on that? And so once the standards are set, so if you have a teacher worksheet, it'll say math 1.12, and that's the standard for math. The school district then has the opportunity to either pull off of the state adopted list the book. I'll use my own children use Journeys for reading, so that's the curriculum that they choose to teach my 6-year-olds how to read. If they don't want to use something off of the state adopted list, they can go through their own process to adopt instructional materials. It just has to go through a review process and an approval process through the school board.
Through the district school board?
Mm-hmm. The district school
So
board.
you're saying that there's a state process for what are acceptable instructional materials, and then there's also a district process?
Correct.
But they still have to meet the standards, the ones that the district can approve.
I guess where I'm a little bit foggy is, you hear things and you don't even know if they're true or not.
Right.
That they're not teaching that George Washington was the first president of the United States anymore. They're teaching other things. I mean, that's a bogus comment all by itself. That's not even true that they're doing that. But the point is, you hear those kind of things, that the instructional materials for American history are not the same as they were 40 years ago when I was in high school. So I'm asking the question, what is the process of which those books are evaluated and approved? They're done at the state level, but then again, they're also done at the district level. And then there's also the opportunity for a book over here to be adopted that doesn't meet a standard.
2 processes, the state level, and all of the books that are on the state adopted list should be completely aligned. It's a verification process that goes through the content experts and through a committee at the department. And then
So there is a committee at the Department of Education
instructional materials.
that is reviewing materials to make sure they meet the state standards.
Correct.
That's kind of the question. That's the answer I was.
Correct, yes. Any other questions or clarifications? Help? Nope. All right, so assessments. Everybody knows something about assessments. So you may have a lot of questions, so please feel free to stop me about what's going on in your district or even in your own home. The primary reason for assessments is to help inform instruction. So they're help inform instruction and measure the student's mastery of the expectations established in the standards. Do you have a question? Not yet. Oh, sure. Sure. There are district-required assessments. Those are what you'll hear are called the formative assessments. And then there's the annual statewide summative assessment. The summative assessment is the end-of-the-year assessment. District assessments are given throughout the year by the teachers to monitor the students' progress and make promotion, retention, resources, decisions. While the number, the type, and the schedule of these assessments are going to vary from district to district to district. The annual statewide assessment is administered at the end of the year, and the goal is to provide timely information to parents about the achievement of the child and their performance of their child's school.
That's every grade level?
Grades 3 through 10. 3 through 10, 11. Okay, I know I'm right. The second page of your handout is just taken from the Department of Education's website and flipped a little bit. But this this handout shows you the spring administration of the Florida Standards Assessment and our science. So this is just of the statewide end of the year summative assessments. The legislature 2 or 3 years ago required that districts post all of their district assessment calendars to their district websites. So not up to the Department of Education's website. So again, because every district is going to have assessments that are going to be different, I didn't print out 67 for your edification. And what you can see here is that in grades 3 through 10, students are assessed on ELA, reading and math, English language arts, and math. In high school, so you're looking at down here at your high school, students have to pass an Algebra 1 course, end of course exam, and the 10th grade English language arts statewide assessment in order to graduate from high school. Referring back to what I said earlier is that we have had an end of course, not an end of course exam, but there has been exit requirements for over 30, 40 years in both English language arts and math. While we're talking about this, it's just important to note that students can demonstrate mastery and proficiency in English language arts and math in 10th grade for graduation more than just this one way. Students can take the ACT or the SAT and earn a concordant score, and thereby meeting the graduation requirements of an exit exam. Sure.
What is the process for them then within their school? So then, if they take the SAT and that qualifies, is there a form that they submit? Is at the beginning of the year, do they work with a counselor on that, or how do they know that? Is it general information for students in that school?
So that's a great question. I will tell you a couple of things. One, it should be general information for the students in the school. So if you have a student that takes the SAT or the ACT prior to the administration of the state standard state end of the year test, then your assessment coordinator in your school and your district should have that information in their portfolio. I don't know specifically whether or not that's happening. Do you have any idea, Jason? And
That's in 5th grade?
mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the student has up to 5 times to take the test between 10th grade and 12th grade. And what we expect is that the administrators in the school are providing every available and viable option and opportunity for the student to demonstrate mastery.
I have a question for Jason. Rep. Rayburn told me that he thinks I was mistaken about if a district chooses their own curriculum outside of what the state has already approved, that it doesn't have to meet the standards. Is that right? Did I get that wrong? And feel free to correct me, because I don't want to put any misinformation out.
No, I'll back up a little bit so we understand the broad picture. So, there's the state standards, and then the state adopts materials that are aligned to those standards. And then when the legislature appropriates funds, it says you must buy materials off that list because we want to invest in what's aligned to the standards. And if you choose not to, then you have to have you can have your own review process and buy materials that are aligned to the standards. However, so that's only talking about the main tool that's used for instruction. But in the day-to-day, when a teacher teaches, they can grab materials from any source they want and use it in the classroom. And there, it's really up to the principal and the school district to determine, and the teacher to determine whether it's aligned. There's no really control over what the teacher uses in the classroom day-to-day. But as for the actual instructional materials, those must be aligned to the standards.
Okay, so it's some of both.
Mm-hmm.
The actual materials, the curriculum that they adopt, even if they adopt it at the local level, is supposed to be aligned to the standards, but they can use day-to-day material that aren't necessarily aligned, but as supplements.
I'm not going to say they can use materials that aren't aligned. They may use materials that are not aligned to the standards.
But they're using that material in order to be sure that the child meets the standards.
Yes, I mean, they may find an additional resource that is more helpful in explaining a concept. Like, I'm pretty sure the videos on Khan Academy are not aligned to our standards, but it demonstrates a general concept of how to deal with fractions that may be more instructive than the teacher is using to help convey the idea. Or if they're teaching history, the book they're using is already out of date, and so they may go out and grab a more recent resource to help explain a topic.
Good morning. To me, this material is pretty straightforward. It's linear, logical. The challenge for most of us, I think, is when we go out into our constituency and manage the politics, which is not always so linear because there's an enormous amount of misinformation. There's all kinds of folks with vested information to set forth misinformation. So maybe I'll direct this to the chairman. Any counsel to all of us as we go out into our constituency and try successfully to work this issue and communicate as honest brokers in this process.
Sure, and this will be a shameless plug for this session, is really separate the myth from the reality, because what happens, it just always happens, it's finger pointing. So, we'll push to the districts push here, parents are confused, and so there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on. But I think first and foremost really is to understand what the reality is. Where the standards come from, where the assessments come from, which assessments, because we all hear it, we're over-tested. When you look at the state assessments, the FSA assessments on this grid for math, writing, English language arts, and then science, it's a core set of testing that's reasonable, but then also understanding which are the state tests, which is here, which then are district tests, because the district schedule will look very different. They'll come to you with a thing that says, hey, every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we have a test. That's your fault. And it's like, if you actually look at it and say, well, we have FSA tests that happen in April. In this case, some of them, the non-computer based, happen in February. Why are all those assessments? Now, testing is always going to happen in schools. The question is it meaningful? And why are they choosing to test in this way or that way? So I do think a starting point is understanding what is our responsibility, what have we prescribed, what are the districts, and what's coming from the State Department of Education. I think the second thing would be is understand the outcomes. And this is personally, I always like to go to the data and understand the outcomes of what these systems are producing or not producing. What is the graduation rates in districts? Is it going up? Is it going down? What is the level of proficiency in math and reading? Has it been going up and going down? I think the best way to judge what we do or what districts do is to eliminate a lot of the rhetoric by says, what are the outcomes? Because in the end, I think every parent, every teacher wants the kids to learn. And this is in this particular area of accountability or test assessments, is what is the appropriate level to be able to measure are our kids learning or not learning. I say third, especially as you go to districts and have specific questions, use our education staff as a resource. Don't go out on a limb and feel like you're out there by yourself. Come back, and you can always ask chairman, you can ask education staff in terms of, can you walk me through this? Or, where is the textbooks in our district being adopted, not adopted? And because those are the things that, you'll get the questions on, and just feel free to come back and ask. Is that enough, Representative Hager?
Awesome, thank you.
Now, I know from conversations with my school districts that a lot of, I won't say a lot, a portion of the testing that they do at the district level are sometimes in order to get federal grant dollars. Sometimes that testing is a way for them to measure teacher performance without having to send someone into the classroom to observe. Other than that, what reasons would the district have to have additional assessments outside of the FSA assessments?
I was going to say, isn't one of the reasons to gauge where the students are, because the schools know that they're going to be, measured and then compensated based on how well their students do. So they're trying to see throughout the semester, all right, how well are my kids doing, and how well they're going to measure up at the end of the semester. You see what I'm saying? So they want to make sure that they're prepared. So they're testing at intervals to make sure the kids are on track to do as well as they want them to do, so that they can receive funding from the state based on the performance of the students. That's part of it.
But then they're pushing back and saying that we're requiring them to do this testing, and we're requiring them to do this testing, but we're not requiring them to do the additional testing. Just a point.
I had a quick question regarding what you were saying, and not to belabor the point or confuse it, but you mentioned something new. In regards to the way we fund schools and the curriculum that they choose to use aligned with the standards, did you say that if a school district does decide to adopt their different curriculum than on that approved list, that there's money attached to that? Does that make sense?
Yes, so there is a instructional materials allocation, and you either have to buy off the state adopted list, or you must have your own process for ensuring that the materials are aligned to the standards. And so you use that instructional materials money to buy your tool of instruction. So there's not a separate fund for the district adopted. There's just one pot, and either method you use, you must determine that those tools are aligned to the standards.
Okay, so just to clarify, they get the same amount of money. However, inevitably, they're going to end up spending a little bit more if they have to go through a process of approving.
Yes, and that's why there is the state adopted process for the economies of scale, because the little districts say really can't do it, and then the big districts say just don't want to get involved in it because you said the time involved. And so the law provides them that opportunity. I'm not sure if there's any district that has established their own separate process for adopting materials.
Chairman, sorry.
There are some larger districts that I thought I had heard had adopted some of their own materials, and if they've already gone through the process of saying that those materials adhere to the standards, then a smaller school district could use those same materials without having to go through that whole same process, right?
I think if they did it as a consortium of districts, like they're going to share, like you'll review these and I'll review these other materials, and then we'll come together and say that they're all aligned. I think they could probably do that.
So once they do that, does it still go back to somebody in the state saying that what they're using is meeting the standards, or that it doesn't meet the standards? I mean, they can use stuff that doesn't meet the state standards. Is that right? In addition to this, they have the books that are approved. They can spend money. They can spend money of their own to use additional materials that are not approved. Is that right?
Yeah. I guess, technically they could, because after they notify the department that they're either buying off the state adopted list, or they're using those funds to buy materials that they have determined that aligned to the list, there's no subsequent verification that those materials are in fact aligned to the standards. So once they've said they've met their burden, then the money is distributed and they can buy those materials.
And it really is a process, whether it's a school district or charter schools, where, the standards are standards. Using the example of that, in first grade, they're going to learn multiplication. I'm making this up. Addition. Zero. It's an advanced school. They're going to be doing calculus, but no, let's say addition 0 to 9, whatever. That's one of the standards. Now, if the districts don't want to use a state adopted list, they just have to show somehow in crosswalk that this material is going to meet those standards. So there's some reasoning behind, but it creates, if counting, learning addition 0 to 9, you can use 42 million different pieces of curriculum material to get there. So the standards are more generic. The curriculum is how they just would have to show that there's a connection. So it does create a lot of flexibility, but at the end, they have to show that these standards, which is not curriculum, they're just benchmarks, will be met by using this material.
I'm not arguing for or against any principles here. I'm just trying to understand. So I'm trying to understand so a district school can decide to use different materials and state to somebody that these have met the standards, and nobody comes back and verifies them or has the right to verify them. I'm just trying to get around, where the power is, and if you want to do something different, do they do it? And I understand that it's okay. Yeah. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yeah, no, I think I think the,
And then it also goes to the fact that at some point, this parents would like to know whether their kids are being taught to a standard or are they off the standard. I mean,
so you're correct. The department doesn't come back once. I'm just going to use Miami-Dade because you're right next to me. Once Miami-Dade decides that this is the curriculum, we've gone through the process, the instructional materials adoption process at the school district level through a series of meetings, which includes parent representatives, and they've adopted their curriculum. I don't believe that the department comes back in and re-reviews all of their curriculum choices. There is a process for appealing, and there is a process for challenging, and Jason and I can put together something.
For who to challenge?
If a parent wants to challenge,
okay.
Their child comes home with a book and it's offensive to them, or they don't think it's a material that's good, they can challenge the district school board. So probably what would be most helpful, just because this is an area of first where instructional materials, where the legislature pays for instructional materials, and something that there's a lot of confusion over. We can put together, Jason and I can put together some sort of either a side-by-side or a flow chart that will show you how it works, which will include an appeals process. So you can see where, when the state decides what they decide, and then if the district decides to exercise local control, where they have the authority to do so under the purview of the system. Yes.
Not directly on that, but I think it may be helpful for some of the newer members. Goes to the frequency of the testing, that's been done. As you'll recall, even those of you who didn't serve, the kind of heightened concern over the volume of testing a couple of years ago. There was this kind of uproar about it, kind of groundswell of concern. And we did address that. And we limited the amount of the district testing that could take place. Maybe you could address that, and just for the benefit of the newer members. And from my own personal vantage point, I have not had any concerns from parents, no complaints since we kind of pared back what the districts could do in terms of interval testing.
You just want to know just a reduction in district assessments?
Yeah, just briefly summarize for the benefit of the newer members kind of what we did in response to that, the heightened concern a few years ago. And then if you maybe could confirm, at least my sense from my district, that it appears as if what we did ameliorated or addressed the concern.
Okay. So when Senate Bill 736 passed, it was our teacher evaluation bill. And it required that teachers be evaluated based on the performance of their students. And for those teachers that they're teaching a state-assessed subject, then they would use the state assessment for that purpose. And then for those that are not subject to a state assessment, the district was required to develop their own assessment. And the idea behind that was to make wouldn't be standardized, but it'd be a more uniform assessment for all the art teachers within a district, so that they know that they're all being measured and being compensated based on the same assessment instrument. But there, as you said, there was a lot of pushback because that would require an assessment for every subject, for every course, and that led to a fear of a proliferation of testing. And so I think it was in 2014 or 15, the legislature decided to reduce the amount of testing, and one of the things they did was remove that requirement. And so for those teachers that do not teach a state-assessed subject, it is up to the district to determine how they will measure the progress of the students they teach. And then there was also an issue about progress monitoring, and we made it a little more flexibility for the districts. And so what the districts have done is they went back and looked at the assessments they provide, and they realized that they were giving both formative assessments and diagnostic assessments kind of like staggered, and so they decided to reduce some of the duplicative testing. And another thing that we did was require, like Joanna said, to make districts put their assessment calendars online, because as the members, you kept getting inquiries or complaints about the amount of testing, and they just kept saying, it's state test, it's state test. And then once they did a survey and looked at it, well, most of those were district assessments. And so a lot of it is just an information campaign to make sure the districts are informing parents of which ones they are requiring and which ones the state is requiring. And through that, because they didn't want to be called on the carpet for all the testing they were doing, they reduced some of their tests. So I think, a common mantra up here is, the more information, the better people can make informed decisions. That helped, the parents and the districts work together to help reduce those assessments.
I didn't have an opportunity yet to go into the school grading and the teacher evaluation. Jason touched on teacher evaluation, but as the chairman said, understanding what these systems are producing and how the districts and how the students are doing is important. So in the school grading model, Florida has a very, very simple model when you really peel it all back. Our elementary, middle, and high school schools are based on the percentage of total points earned by a school for each component in the measure. So in elementary school, we're looking at the student achievement learning gains, and the learning gains of the lowest 25%. Student achievement is your proficiency, if you've scored a level 3 or higher on the Florida assessment. Your student learning gains is going to be how much have you moved from the first day of school to the last day of school. And then the learning gains of your lowest 25%. This is a unique to Florida, and what it does is in every elementary school in the state, regardless of whether or not you have all level 3 readers or all level 1, you look at your lowest performing population and the requirement that we want those students to move. In middle school, we add in the school grade is now based on your student achievement plus the percentage of students who pass a high school end of course exam or an industry certification. An industry certification. So we're looking at middle schools that are doing acceleration with the 7th and 8th graders and presumably some of your 6th graders. And then in high school, we look at achievement plus the important things to parents, to you guys, to everybody, which is your overall, are your kids graduating in 4 years? How are your percentage of students that are eligible to earn college credit within the high school system, either through an AP course, an IB course, dual enrollment, or industry certification? The legislature went through a process a couple of years ago to do what was called bring back the basics of the school grading system so that it is a more transparent system for people to understand, parents to understand, and for principals to understand as well. And then lastly, because we're at a 10-minute warning, I believe, is that teacher evaluations, current teacher evaluations are based on 1/3 of your student performance and 2/3 of your instructional practice. It could be 1/3 of instructional practice and 1/3 on a district selected indicator, but for the easiest way that I look at it is 1/3 of it is going to be, a teacher is going to be based on how well their student achieved, and then the other 2/3 components is made up of what they're doing in the classroom and their instructional practice.
If I could ask a question. So is the way you measure how the teacher did according to student performance is how far the students progressed? Not that they were in a low level, but that they actually progressed a certain amount? You understand my question? Is it, so is the performance of the student the improvement of the student? Is that one of the measures?
Yeah, so it's a portion, it's 1/3 based on proficiency, that's on a 1 through 5. Did they learn it? I mean, did they master it? But then the other portion of it is on learning gain. Did they progress? So there's a balance between are they proficient and did they progress, which equalizes, kind of equalizes scores.
Just a question. I think maybe you just answered the question, but I had a teacher come to me recently who she really loves working with the really challenging students, right? And so as a result, her principal typically places all the challenging students in her classroom. And so her concern is that she is improperly penalized or negatively impacted by her desire to help the troubled students.
So in the end, 2/3 of it is going to be based on did they progress? Because there's kind of 3 buckets. Are they proficient? Did they have learning gains is the second. Third is the bottom 25% of the school. Did they learn? And so 2/3 is based on the growth of the student. So no, and that's the fairness of it, because you could get really, really bright kids, but the challenge for that teacher, they'll all be proficient, but she's going to have to push them to learn. Or you could, in that case, have really low kids, but then 2/3 of that is going to be based on did they learn. So it balances out.